The chamber smelled like lightning. That was the first thing I noticed when the doors sealed behind me. Not the walls, which were made of something that was not quite glass and not quite crystal, pulsing softly with light the color of deep water. Not the 11 other beings arranged around the circular room, some of them breathing in ways I had no name for, some of them perfectly still in the manner of creatures who had learned that stillness was a form of survival. Not the proctor, standing at the center with his long silver robes and his 4 eyes, and his expression of patient, almost sorrowful formality. No, the first thing I noticed was the smell, sharp, clean, electric. Like the air before a thunderstorm breaks. Like the moment right before something important happens, and your body knows it before your brain does. I had smelled that smell before. In hospitals. In exam halls. In the particular silence of a room where someone is about to tell you something that will change everything. I sat down in my assigned position and folded my hands in my lap and waited. My name is Dr. Mara Solis. I am 38 years old. I spent 15 years studying the science of how minds break, what conditions cause consciousness to fracture, what the warning signs look like, and occasionally, when the research went well, what helps put things back together. I was chosen to represent humanity at the cognitive sovereignty trial, not because I was the strongest human alive, or the most brilliant, or the most decorated. I was chosen because my entire career had been built around one question that most researchers found too uncomfortable to study directly. What does a mind look like from the inside when it is surviving something it was not built to survive? I knew the answer. I knew it from years of research, and I knew it from something else, something more personal. Something I had never put in a paper but that lived in me the way old injuries live in the body. Quietly, mostly, until the weather changes. I knew what it looked like, because I had been there myself. The proctor's name was Kale Raveth. He belonged to a species called the Vethari, and his people had been traveling between stars for so long that the concept of a beginning was more philosophical than historical for them. They were tall and pale, and moved with the careful economy of beings who had decided, long ago, that nothing needed to be rushed. They had contributed many things to the galactic conclave over the centuries: medicine, mathematics, architectural theory, but their most celebrated contribution was the cognitive architecture trial, a system of examination so sophisticated, so precisely engineered, that it had become the galactic standard for determining whether a mind was truly sovereign, whether it could govern itself, whether it could be trusted with real power. Humanity had arrived in galactic society 7 years earlier, stumbling and loud, and carrying approximately 400 years of accumulated argument about whether we deserved to be here. The conclave had admitted us on a provisional basis, which meant we had a seat at certain tables and a voice in certain discussions, but not all of them, not the ones that mattered most. For full membership, for a permanent seat with real authority, we needed to pass the trial. 1 representative, 9 stages, 9 hours on the clock. Kale Raveth moved to the center of the room and began to speak, and the translation device in my ear rendered his words into something that sounded almost but not quite like English, the way a very precise copy of a thing is always slightly uncanny. He explained the stages one by one, in a voice that was gentle and somewhat apologetic, the way a doctor explains a procedure they know will be painful. The first stage was a logic spiral, an infinite recursive paradox that had no solution, not because the designers had been lazy, but because the absence of a solution was the point. The mind chases resolution. The spiral removes it. Most minds, he explained, spend between 40 minutes and 2 hours before they learn to stop chasing and simply sit with the absence. The ones that never learn simply chase until something breaks. The second stage was a memory distortion field. Personal memories would be replayed with their emotional content inverted. Things I loved would feel like grief. Things I was proud of would feel like shame. The brain, presented with a history it did not recognize as its own, would begin to question the foundation of identity itself. The third stage introduced a space where cause and effect worked in reverse. Consequences came before choices. Intentions followed actions. The mind, which is fundamentally a machine for making narrative sense of time, finds this condition almost physically painful. He continued, Stage 4, Stage 5, Stage 6, each one more precise than the last, each one targeting a different layer of the self, peeling it back carefully, methodically, the way a scientist takes apart a watch to see what makes it keep time. Stage 7 was meaninglessness, not the vague philosophical kind, but a mathematically constructed environment of pure, clean, logical void. No false hope was permitted, no symbolic escape. The mind was placed inside a space that was designed to be completely, rigorously, provably without purpose. Stage 8 was silence of a kind I did not have a word for. Consciousness without sensation, without memory, without language. Nothing to hold and nothing to hold on to. The self, stripped of everything it uses to define itself, floating in nothing. Stage 9 was the last and the hardest, and the one that had never been completed by anyone. The exam would present the subject with a philosophical argument, perfectly constructed, internally consistent, without logical flaw, that the subject had never existed, that consciousness was a useful error, that the sense of being a self was simply a story a brain tells itself, and the story was not true. The subject would need to rebut the argument, not emotionally, logically, without appealing to personal experience, because Stage 8 had removed personal experience as a valid category. Kale Raveth finished speaking. He looked around the room at the 12 of us, and his 4 eyes were patient and sad and kind. He said that the chamber would initialize in 3 minutes, and that we should use the time to center ourselves, however our respective traditions suggested. He said that the exam was designed to reveal, not to humiliate, that no mind that failed the trial was diminished by the failure, that some of the greatest intellects in galactic history had sat in this chamber and emerged changed, and there was no shame in that. He said this in the tone of someone who had said it many times before, and genuinely meant it, and knew it would not make the next 9 hours easier. Then he stepped back, and the chamber hummed, and the neural field began to initialize. I felt it start. A faint pressure behind my eyes, and then a kind of unwinding, like the moment before sleep, when thoughts begin to lose their edges. The logic spiral was beginning to spool up, patient and enormous, a trap made of pure thought. I recognized it immediately. Not from research, not from any paper I had written or any clinical description I had read. I recognized it the way you recognize a street you grew up on, even when the light is different and years have passed and everything looks slightly wrong. I had been here before. I had been here at 23, during the worst year of my depression, when my thoughts had looped and found no exit, and I had sat in my apartment for 3 days, unable to determine whether getting up was worth the effort, because every argument I made for getting up could be turned back on itself, and every argument against could be turned back on itself, and the loop had no end. I had not solved it then. I had not escaped it cleanly or cleverly. I had simply sat inside it until it became familiar, until it became something I could carry, rather than something that was carrying me. The memory distortion field felt like grief. It felt like the specific grief of my father's death, which had happened when I was 31, which had arrived at a time when I had not had the resources to process it correctly, and so it had sat inside me, wrong-shaped, a thing I returned to over and over, and found still painful, still strange, still not fitting the shape I expected grief to have. I sat inside that too. I had practice. The reversed causality of Stage 3 felt like dissociation, which I had experienced for almost 2 years in my late 20s, when a panic disorder had removed me from the normal flow of time and left me watching my own life from a slight distance, unable to tell clearly whether I was making choices or simply watching choices happen to me. I had spent years in therapy learning to tolerate that feeling rather than fight it, because fighting it made it worse, and tolerating it made it eventually, slowly, become something I could manage. I moved through the stages the way I had learned to move through difficult things. Not quickly, not heroically, simply with the patience of someone who had been here before and knew the shape of the terrain. Stage 4 felt like the years I had spent uncertain of who I was. Stage 5 felt like grief on a loop, and I had done grief on a loop. Stage 6 felt like being outside time, and I had been outside time. Stage 7, the mathematically perfect void, the clean and logical absence of meaning, felt like the question I had written an entire unfinished dissertation about. The question of whether consciousness is real, whether the self is true, whether any of it matters in any sense that is not self-referential. I had lived inside that question for 3 years. I had not answered it. I had done something harder. I had learned to act despite it, to get up and make coffee and call someone and keep going, not because I had resolved the question, but because I had decided, without any good logical reason at all, that the question did not have to be resolved before life could continue. Stage 8 was silence. I sat in it, the way I had learned to sit in silence. Present, loose, not demanding that it become something else. Stage 9 presented me with the argument that I did not exist. I considered it seriously, the way I had been trained to consider arguments seriously. It was well constructed. It used all the right premises. It was, as promised, logically consistent. And then I thought about something that had nothing to do with logic. I thought about the fact that I was currently composing, in the back of my mind, the story of how this morning had gone, because I was going to tell it to my colleague Priya when I got back, and Priya was going to laugh in a particular way she had, and that was something I was specifically looking forward to. I thought about the bad coffee my assistant Taelo always had waiting. I thought about the smell of rain on pavement, which has no logical significance whatsoever. I did not rebut the argument with logic. I rebutted it with the simple, stubborn, entirely illogical fact of my own continued presence. I am here. I have always been here. I have been here through things that were harder than this argument, and I am still here, and that is not a logical claim. It is just true. The chamber completed. I opened my eyes. Kale Raveth was still speaking. He had not finished his introductory remarks. He was somewhere in the middle of explaining stage 4 when the completion signal fired from my chamber position, a tone he had clearly never heard during an opening address, because he stopped mid-sentence and looked at me with an expression that, across every species boundary and every biological difference, I recognized as confusion. He checked the panel. He checked it again. He excused himself from the room for 40 minutes and came back with 3 senior conclave arbiters who asked me many careful questions about my experience, and then sat together looking at the results for a long time in silence. One of them finally told me that humanity had earned full conclave membership. She also told me, in a voice that was thoughtful and very quiet, that the trial was going to need to be redesigned, that a trial any member of a species could reasonably pass was not functioning as intended. I said that seemed like a problem with the trial. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said that yes, they were beginning to understand that. Tylo had terrible coffee waiting when I got back to the diplomatic quarters. I drank all of it. It was wonderful. He asked how it went. I told him we got the seat. He asked what it was like. I thought about it for a moment. I thought about 9 stages of the most sophisticated cognitive examination in the known galaxy, designed by a species that had been studying consciousness for longer than humanity had been building cities. I thought about the lightning smell, and the pulsing walls, and Kale Raveth's careful, apologetic voice. I thought about 23 and 31, and the 2 years I spent outside of time, and the dissertation I never finished, and every hard thing I had ever simply sat inside until it became familiar. I told him, it felt like every difficult thing I had already survived, except this time, someone was watching. He stared at me. I finished the coffee and looked out the window at the stars, which were very numerous, and very far away, and very beautiful, in the specific way that things are beautiful when you have recently been reminded that you are still here to look at them. The Veth Ari had built the most advanced instrument in the galaxy for testing the limits of a mind. They had calibrated it against the most resilient intellects in known history. They had designed it to be, for any species that encountered it, the hardest thing they had ever faced. They had not accounted for a species that arrives pre-acquainted with hard things. They had not accounted for minds that have already been to the void and come back and learned to make coffee afterward. They had not accounted for the particular, stubborn, entirely unreasonable human habit of surviving things we were not built to survive, and then getting up, and then telling someone about it, and then doing it again. We do not break less than other species. We simply have more practice with being broken, and deciding that does not have to be the end of the story.